Today, we're kicking off the first episode in our new series From AI to Z, where we talk to healthcare policy leaders and experts about the role of artificial intelligence in healthcare. Our first guest is Troy Tazbaz, Director of the Digital Health Center of Excellence at FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Troy brings a wealth of knowledge as someone with experience in both the private sector and at FDA. And I look forward to hearing his unique perspectives on the innovation in AI-enabled devices, as well as what he sees as the biggest challenges and opportunities for our members developing these new technologies. I hope you enjoy today's conversation. Troy, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah. It's great to be here.
I always like to start these by giving the listener a little bit of a background on the person I'm interviewing, the person behind the big title. So tell us, Troy, where did you grow up? Where were you born and raised? A little bit about your background.
I was born in San Mateo, California, Burlingame, California, in the Bay Area. And I was there until about 9 years old, then went to Turkey for 8 years and came back when I was 17 to go to college. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then where did you end up going to college?
In San Diego.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to have a California experience, a true California experience.
Was that because you spent 9 years in Turkey?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was the experience like in Turkey, by the way?
I think it was interesting going there as a 9-year-old.
Yeah.
Not speaking the language, having a different culture, but I think that it probably influenced me considerably. And eventually I got into international business, and my ability to adapt probably came from that experience and feel comfortable with different cultures.
Yeah, that's great. It's great for kids to have that experience at a young age, I think, though not many do, right?
They're very adaptable.
Yeah, very adaptable.
Adults were not adaptable.
Yeah, that's right. So so you went to college, and what did you study in college?
I started with mechanical engineering,
okay,
and then I switched to computer science.
Okay. And then did you go on to graduate school after that, or did you jump right in the workforce?
I jumped right in the workforce because this was in the mid-'90s, and there's something called the internet was taking off, and I just had some friends that were working for an internet service provider, one of the first ones in the country, and they said, "Can you come and work for us?" And I said, "Sure." Yeah. And so that's how I got into technology.
Wow, isn't that interesting? And so what company was that? And then what was the rest of your sort of tech journey like?
Yeah, so that was called SurfNet, which was California Educational Research Federation. So initially they were developed to run the supercomputer centers for the UC systems. From there, I went to BlueMountain.com.
Okay.
The cute little online greeting cards.
Yeah.
This was in the 90s as well. And then from there, I just kind of went back into the startup world, went back to San Francisco to work for Ning, which was Mark Andreessen's company. And then because of my background in engineering and data centers, I ended up going to a very large data center provider called Equinix.
Okay.
But I would say that my probably career was developed at Oracle, where I was for 11 years.
Okay.
And I started in the real estate department designing data centers for them, and slowly started managing different aspects of the business, got into the business side of things, and eventually worked in the CEO's office working on strategy for the corporation.
And when did healthcare become something that was interesting to you? I assume the transition between IT, traditional technology, and healthcare was an interesting one for you.
Yeah. At Oracle, I had this one role where I was kind of a catch-all, and so if something needed to be fixed, I would usually get called, and something needed to be incubated, I would get called and say, "Can you launch this business unit?" And I think they were struggling with finding a general manager for the business unit, and Oracle is verticalized. So they asked me to incubate it, and so that's how I got into healthcare. But really, I think my passion for healthcare started when I dealt with, my wife had cancer, and I spent a lot of time in the hospital system dealing with her cancer treatments. And so that's where I probably developed some of the thought process that I have around technology use in a hospital, medical care.
During that time, from when you first went into the IT space to today, and through your personal journey, you've seen a lot of transformation in the healthcare IT, healthcare technology space, right? What's that been like? Talk about what you've seen as you've come along.
I think data is becoming more important, right? I mean, I think people are looking for data to reduce the more episodic nature of healthcare. And you do need data for that, right? To understand patterns, to understand progression, compared against other benchmarks. And so I think data is going to become more important, particularly with AI. I mean, it requires data.
Right.
That's all it is.
Right.
It's just data.
The technologies themselves have moved really quickly as well, right? The type of technologies, the speed at which those technologies improve and innovate as well. To me, from where I sit, it's been incredibly fascinating. And then the connected nature of devices, really in the last 5 years, has been remarkable. I think about, my daughter's a type 1 diabetic, and I think about it in the diabetes space, right? And how much technology has changed a patient's life, right? If you get that right, from data to the technology itself, the impact we can have on people's lives is quite dramatic.
Being able to essentially monitor someone's health outside of the hospital system is going to become a very important part of this. And I think that's going to do multiple things. One, it's we're going to have a much better understanding of longitudinal health of a patient, but also you're going to start engaging with your own health probably in a much different way.
Right.
I know a lot of people don't like it when I say this, but I mean, United States doesn't really have a healthcare system. We have a medical care system.
Right.
Healthcare system is when you're healthy,
right,
and you're engaged with your health.
Yeah. That I hadn't thought about it that way. That's a good way to think about it. Yeah. So, what led you to transition from Oracle into a government agency at the FDA? Why'd you do that? And tell me about that journey.
Yeah, I know it's not very common, right? Especially kind of where I was with my career. But as I mentioned, my wife was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. She ended up passing away about 4.5 years ago, and this was right before the pandemic, about 2 months or 3 months before the pandemic. And here I am, kind of lost in many ways.
Right.
And now I'm locked in the house.
Right.
And Oracle was really good about distracting me, and they understood how to occupy my mind. So they were keep giving me problems to solve. But I think I was probably not taking care of myself because I was so distracted with work. And there was a moment where we acquired a company called Cerner, and I was asked to help integrate the company itself. And I realized that was about 2 years ago. I never really took care of myself. And years ago, I had this desire to bike across the country. And I decided that I was going to bike across the country, and I couldn't stop thinking about that.
Right.
And so I told Oracle that I was biking across the country, and they said, well, are you going to take a sabbatical? And I said, no, because I don't know if I'm going to come back. Like, I don't know if 2 months or 3 months is enough. And when I did come back, I'm kind of glad that I actually ended up leaving. Not because of anything with Oracle, it's just it gave me that opportunity to be flexible with what I want to do. And coincidentally, about a month and a half after I got back from the bike ride, FDA called. It was Jeff Shuren and Doug Kelly that reached out, and they were looking for someone from Silicon Valley that had executive leadership background. But I always joke, like, I had no medical background, no regulatory affairs background, and I was not a lawyer, so I was perfect for the job.
Exactly. I want to jump into the FDA conversation, but before I do that, I want to go back to the transcontinental bike ride. That sounds like a fascinating process. How long did it take you to train for it, first of all? And then what was the entire journey like? How long did that take?
Well, you don't really train for it.
Yeah.
I think you build your endurance during it.
Okay.
But I was a cyclist. Like,
Okay.
I didn't get off the couch and to go right across the country. Most people do it in about 3 to 4 months. I did it in 2 months.
Wow.
I was a little aggressive.
Wow.
But part of me was, I just wanted to bike.
Yeah.
And I wanted to just bike.
Yeah.
And be with my thoughts. It's surprising what I also discovered, that you didn't really have a whole lot of time to drift off into your thoughts. You had to be very alert majority of the time. But it took me exactly 58 days from dipping the rear wheel coincidentally in Maryland.
Wow.
In Chesapeake Bay, and then dipped the front wheel in San Francisco Bay.
How about that?
I took 8 days off, so 50 days of biking, so around 80 miles a day.
Was the 8 days at one time, or did you
No,
spread that out
we
over
spread
like
that out, yeah.
once every couple weeks?
Yeah.
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 Yeah. How exhausting was that?
Physically, emotionally, which one?
Both, actually.
I,
That is.
it was quite exhausting,
Yeah.
but I think there were good days and bad days.
Yeah.
It wasn't just overall exhaustion,
Yeah.
or it wasn't that I was building up. There were points where I was very much. I remember actually I was in Utah and I started yelling at the sky for some odd reason, like that Lieutenant Dan moment in
Yeah.
Forrest Gump.
Yeah.
Like why? And it was just it was hail, and I was
Right.
going up this very steep. And then I started laughing, and I said, I don't remember anyone putting a gun to my head to say, quit your job and go back across the country.
Right.
So this is all on me.
Yeah.
And yeah.
That's fascinating. Were there any lessons, Troy, leadership lessons or work lessons or something that you took from that ride that kind of has now shaped the way you think about leading at FDA?
Patience is definitely one of them.
Mm.
Sticking to it.
Yeah.
I mean, I've always, but patience is definitely something you have to exercise because it's a very different environment coming
Right.
from a very fast-paced, moving industry
Yeah.
to the government where you have to be much more thoughtful about the things that you focus on.
Right.
And so you're trying to introduce agility to a process, but you have to be also very thoughtful and ensure that you're not just trying to break things.
Right. Yeah.
Because what you break is just different.
Right. Right. When you first got to FDA, how were your expectations different than what you see now after having been there for a year and a half?
Well, one, I didn't have a whole lot of expectations. I had assumptions about
Yeah.
government. But I will say this, Jeff, we had probably, I don't know, close to 15 calls or something like that. And I actually wrote and said, this is what based on all of our discussions, based on my discussions with the industry, this is what I think I'm going to focus on. Let me know if you agree with these. And he said, like, that's exactly what we're looking for. So I was fortunate to not come into an existing organization with an existing set of priorities.
Right.
I had the freedom to change those priorities, and we did.
Yeah.
Very aggressively change
Okay.
them. And so, surprisingly, it was we did it very fast, and but it took some time for
Yeah.
people to be okay with that pace of change in direction.
So walk us through the priorities that you have now that you've been in the role for a while. What's the role of the FDA now with the speed at which technology is moving with digital innovation and AI? Talk about what your priorities are now.
When I joined, I worked with my leadership team, and we spent about a month and a half coming up with like 3, I would call, guiding principles. And we said we're going to envision what the future of healthcare is going to look like. We're going to enable it through dealing with regulatory issues, friction in the process, and then we're going to expand it, and that's through ensuring development of these medical products are thinking through bias issues, the population, and then of course education. And so those were kind of the 3 pillars. When I joined, obviously this was just at the beginning of the generative AI craze, and it's very interesting because all the noise that we hear right now is generative AI.
Right.
AI has been in healthcare for a very long time.
Yep.
I think the first AI-enabled device we approved was back in 1992.
Mm-hmm.
And so we wanted to make sure that we understood the problems that would come with generative AI. The second part of that equation was I spent a lot of time talking to the industry around what are their pain points. And one thing was in common was that it's hard to find information to help you navigate the system. And so we launched a program called Regulatory Accelerator that really connects a lot of the dots within the process itself, that so startups can also be able to navigate through the process without having multiple regulatory affairs folks on staff because they can't afford that. And so those were really the big projects that we had. And then the other thing we wanted to focus on was how do we actually speak to companies that were not large?
Mm-hmm.
FDA struggled with that as well.
Right.
And so I wanted to bring, even though I came from a large corporation, I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley. And so I wanted to make sure that we were able to get some of that voice going
Mm-hmm.
and help companies with innovation who are highly innovative, highly agile, be successful at the process itself.
Right.
Now, I can't determine whether their product is good or not,
Right.
but at least
Right.
help them navigate through that process.
Yeah. What have you found to be the biggest difference between how you speak to a larger company that's done a lot of product innovation over the years and a startup that might have one incredible idea, but how do you speak to them differently?
Well, there's an existential crisis that they deal with,
Right.
smaller companies, where if the product is not going to be successful, that's pretty much the end of the company. Whereas a larger corporation can afford to do innovation, fail on the innovation, do more, right? So you have to be conscientious about some of the key issues with what a smaller company would be dealing with. And one of them is understanding the regulatory process.
Right.
But also ask them questions around, do they understand what their business model is?
Yeah.
You don't have to really have those discussions with a large corporation because they understand what their business model
Right.
is.
Right. Innovation seems, from where I sit, seems to be moving so rapidly, right? And government agencies don't at least have a history of necessarily keeping up with the speed of private sector innovation, right? How do you see the FDA now from where your team is? How do you keep up with everything that's coming at you in the digital and AI space and not slow things down?
Well, we spend a lot of time with public-private partnerships to ensure that we understand what's going on. But we're also focused on what's not being done right now.
Okay.
And we hired really talented folks, both on the policy side of things as well as the engineering side.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have a clinical team that is really responsible for the integration of these technologies,
Mhm.
because without that, it's just a technology, right?
Right.
And then we have obviously a strategic collaboration team that is really driving those public-private partnerships. And so what we've been spending a lot of time and focus, particularly with on the engineering side, is really standards development.
Okay.
And so you can approach regulation multiple ways, where you can just write something and hope it makes sense from. And what I believe regulation is just it's boundaries, right? It's parameters that you have to operate within. But what we're also trying to do is contribute to standards development,
Right.
best practices development, things that are not guidance specific,
Right.
but hopefully will inspire the industry to focus on and of course continuously develop new standards as they learn more,
Yeah.
particularly with generative AI.
Yeah. So from where you sit and you look out at the industry now, what people are doing, you have a unique view from the regulator's perspective, but also to some degree from the payer's perspective, right? When you're inside government, what do you see as the biggest challenge for companies who are innovating right now? And then secondly, what do you see as the biggest opportunity? I know those are big questions, but
Well, I guess I'll have to answer that depending on the size of the company, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a smaller company, I think their biggest challenge is probably not understanding how technology gets integrated.
yeah.
And because they don't understand that, they end up developing features, and features don't usually get coverage. And the other thing would be not understanding their business model around how to get paid.
Mm-hmm.
I've done product development in the past, and one of the things that we would always ask is like, how are we going to get paid for this? Like, is this, what's the method of the revenue source?
Right.
And so smaller companies, I think, struggle with that, where they're not asking that question because Silicon Valley tends to fall in love with the product itself.
Right.
And instead of actually understanding how a sound business model is going to work. The other thing is, the difference between a feature versus kind of a product versus an application.
Right.
I see a lot of features being developed, and someone has to integrate that.
Yeah.
Hospital systems are not going to integrate that.
Right.
That is not their core competency, nor do they want a solution.
Right.
They want an outcome. And so I would say that's probably the bigger challenges, those two challenges for smaller companies. I think the larger companies, they don't necessarily struggle with the whole payment thing, but it is actually how to continuously evolve and innovate with new information. I think that data ends up becoming a big opportunity for them.
Right.
That I'm not sure that they're taking advantage of.
Yeah. On the how do you get paid side, I think it's a fascinating question, right? If you're in the traditional IT space and the consumer business, it's a little more straightforward how you get paid, right? Create a product,
Right.
you know where you can go to sell it, you know what the market looks like, you have a plan for that. But when you're in the healthcare space, and then you add to it the healthcare AI space, you're dealing with a set of payers that are very different, right? You have public payers that you have to deal with and all the challenges there. You have private payers you have to deal with and the challenges go with that. How would you advise a company as they're trying to think about that question? Like, how am I going to get paid? When do you develop that plan? How do you develop that plan? How does it fit into the regulatory process at FDA as well?
Well, first I would truly understand the market
Yeah.
and the addressable market. And I think that what's happening right now is that people see the $4.5 trillion market size,
Right.
and they think that's the actual market size.
Right.
But in my previous role, we used to look at IT spend as a percentage of the total revenue of the industry itself to determine who is essentially investing in IT. And one of the things that we understood was healthcare spends on the lower end side of things. It's about 2.5 to 3%. So if you say 3%, that $4.5 trillion becomes $150 billion. That's your total IT
Right.
for the United States healthcare sector. Well, you have to start removing things like EHR. You have to start removing back office systems like enterprise resource planning, human capital management, supply chain management. You have to start removing some of the IT devices.
Right.
And so emerging technology ends up becoming a very, very small percentage of that. That's your addressable market.
Right.
It is not $4.5 trillion. And so I think really understanding what your addressable and obtainable market is going to be key. The other thing is then you have to truly understand the clinical trial aspect of it. Like, what are you solving?
Right.
And how is that going to either improve the bottom line of the hospital system, improve outcomes for patients, improve medical professional satisfactions? And I always kind of talk about understand the quintuple aim of healthcare if you really want to understand the type of products that you have to develop.
Right.
Because this is the strategic kind of priorities for the healthcare. So I always say to developers, like, understand the quintuple aim, and if you can't answer those as part of your product development process, you're not probably developing a product for the industry.
Yeah. When you talk about understanding your market, back to that question again, it seems like in healthcare, other stakeholders play a larger role than maybe in other businesses to help you better understand your market, right? And it makes me wonder if there's a more proactive role that a government payer, CMS for example, could take in helping someone who's developing this technology better understand what that market could be eventually once they get through the FDA process. Do you think that's right? And from where you sit, do you see a role for CMS to play earlier in the process than they may have in the past?
So these are some of my own personal opinions on
Yeah.
this one. I do believe that we should be trying to harmonize clinical trial requirements between the FDA process as well as CMS coverage decision process.
Yep.
And I do think that we should be investing in education around how to ask the right set of questions that you'll most likely end up facing
Right.
when you're going through that process.
Right.
And so at FDA, we have been investing in things like I mentioned regulatory accelerator, where we're building these navigation aids to say, okay, well, if you're first ask the question, are you a regulated product or not regulated? If you are regulated, what regulation are you having to follow? So what we're trying to do is invest in those tooling and make it easy for anyone to essentially be able to navigate through that process. Right?
Right.
It shouldn't be this complicated. And when we launched this project, I said, let them fail because the product failed, not because they didn't understand the process.
Right. That's a very good point. Yeah, it's a great point.
And it's the same thing with CMS, right?
Yeah,
I mean, you have to let them fail because they did not factor in some of the considerations. Now, here's a very simple one. So CMS, let's say they're going to use Medicare as for a coverage decision.
Right.
If you come to them and you've done your clinical trials with a bunch of people who are in their 20s and 30s, they could very well say this is not our constituents.
Right.
And that's a very valid argument.
Right.
How do I know this is going to work for the 65 plus year olds?
Right.
And so, again, understand your addressable market, understand who your constituents are. How are you going to effectively, what is the medical product for?
Right. I think, well, I won't put words in your mouth. I'll just give you my opinion. I think if CMS had a CMS accelerator, a payer accelerator process that was uniquely situated in connection to the FDA accelerator process, that it would speed up innovation in a meaningful way, and it would also have the effect of allowing people to fail sooner if they knew on both sides what it was going to take, right, and clear the market a little bit so that the true innovations can zip through more quickly. And my hope is that CMS will learn from what you all are doing at FDA and take those lessons and apply it to the payer side so that that part of the acceleration can be implemented as well. So that's Scott's opinion. You don't have to comment on it because you're inside government now.
The TAP program that Doug Kelly actually launched within excuse me, FDA is a perfect example of trying to understand the total product life cycle, the end-to-end.
Right.
And so I think that's going to be, and it's already showing
very helpful.
Very helpful, right? I mean, it's bearing fruit because it's, to your point, like fail fast.
Yeah.
It's slightly different in healthcare where the R&D process is so lengthy that you don't really have the opportunity to fail fast. But nonetheless, I think if you start from the beginning and just say, this is the phases of developing a product.
Yeah.
At what point do you engage with FDA? At what point do you engage with CMS? What point do you actually determine how you're going to get paid for the product itself? And I think what Doug Kelly is doing with TAP program is showing our desire to want to support the industry through that process.
Yeah. I've said a lot. One of the things, if we learned anything from COVID that should stick with us going forward, it is that public-private partnerships are the best way to get to innovative outcomes quickly. And it applies not only to FDA, the regulator, or EPA, the regulator, but also to the purchasers as well. In healthcare, primarily CMS and buyers in that space, but also VA and other purchasers of healthcare as well. The more collaboration we have up front, the more likely it is that you get really good outcomes. And it seems like it's more true in healthcare than maybe anywhere else, quite frankly. Your thoughts on that?
So I 100% agree with you, but healthcare is an ecosystem.
Yeah.
And so unlike different industries, you need collaboration.
Right.
And I don't think that we're going to be successful if the industry and the federal government are not working together.
Right.
You just have to understand each of their considerations, right? And you have to find, any good partnership requires a common set of priorities. Right. So if you cannot align on those set of priorities, it's going to be very difficult. But when I joined FDA, that was one of my key effective strategic priorities was make sure whatever we do, I call them guiding principles.
Yeah.
Make sure whatever you do, work on developing public-private partnerships.
Yeah.
It doesn't work without that.
Yeah, that's right.
Because you want to influence the industry and you want to also get feedback from the industry as much as you can around the issues that you're having to deal with in the federal government.
Yeah. There's also no question when you're sitting where I am and where you used to be, that if you know that the government is coming in to help you get your product to patients, the likelihood of trust and collaboration goes up tremendously. If the private industry views you as a sort of a police state approach, right? You're always watching out for, hold them in a great deal of skepticism, not certain if you can be helpful to them. It sort of freezes that process as well. I think FDA under Jeff's leadership deserves a lot of credit because you've changed, I think, dramatically the way industry thinks about FDA and the way FDA thinks about the industry. And from our perspective, it's been it's been very, very helpful.
I agree. And I've been very pleased with coming into FDA, working with other centers as well around their desire to keep progressing forward and making sure that they're enabling the industry to progress forward, right?
Yeah.
I mean, our job is, as regulators, to, again, provide the rules of the road based on risks and different considerations that you have to factor in with public health. And if we do that effectively, I think that gives the guidance for the industry to know that this is the boundaries that you have to operate. I hear this a lot from West Coast, where like, oh, innovation, it's impeded by regulation, and I kind of laugh at that, and I always say, give me another industry that doesn't have a regulation. And some of these things are, again, it's operating parameters. Is what it is. I mean, whether you're going to space, or you're a financial institution, or you're an autonomous vehicle, or not an autonomous vehicle, you always have regulations that you have to deal with, because those are safety boundaries. And so I don't necessarily agree with someone saying that, regulation that impedes innovation. I think that innovation always has to work within those safety parameters.
Yeah, I agree with you. Bad regulation can impede innovation.
Bad regulation can.
But if done correctly and in collaboration, not only does it make innovation better, it protects companies, right? In order to make sure they get the right product to the patients at the right time, and it's safe, and it protects investment. It does a lot of really, really good things, which is why the collaboration is so important, right? If there's no collaboration, it leads to bad regulation. If there's no collaboration, it can lead to a bad product, right? And the whole process is skewed as a result of it. So,
look, the way I see it, and again, this is probably stemming from my background in the private sector, it's like a regulation that is not implementable by the industry is just a piece of paper. That's all it is. And I say that often, actually, with an FDA.
Yeah, that's right. Reflect back on your time in a year and a half, and we've covered this in different chunks through this interview, but if you're giving advice to companies who are in the digital or AI space, and they're trying to decide what they should do, how should they approach FDA, what sort of philosophical or general guidance would you give them on that process?
Well, understand what product you're developing, the risks associated to that product, because that changes everything, right? How are you going to integrate the product? How are you doing your clinical trials? How are you validating this product before you even come into FDA? But that means that you have to engage sooner. I would say there are great processes and programs that FDA has been implementing that allows that that engagement to happen much sooner, and I think that's important to not fear engaging with FDA.
Right.
I think that's probably a perception issue.
Right.
I'll tell you a little anecdote. When I was at Oracle, we had this one life sciences product that we were unable to update because the pharmaceuticals were using it for safety tracking for their clinical trials. And at one point, we're band-aiding this thing, and then we said, can we at least upgrade the database? Like, we just need to update the database. I'm like, no. If you touch that, FDA will most likely reject our submission. So I was like, we're talking about updating the database.
Right.
I told that story when I came to FDA, and people laughed. Like, I don't know why. I said, well, perception is reality.
Right.
So how do we fix that?
Yeah.
Right. So, but the only way you're going to do that is engaging sooner.
Yeah, that's right. Let's transition, Troy, to AI and talk about that a little bit. I think AI is really misunderstood by a lot of people, right? There are some who are concerned about it, scared of it, not certain what it means, particularly in healthcare, right? What do you know about it, and how can you sort of calm people's fears or concerns about the future of AI in healthcare?
Well, I think the first thing that we should do is be clear around this concept of predictive versus generative AI, and a lot of the noise that we are hearing and it's being written about is generative AI.
Yep.
And that really started last year around March, where the current capabilities that we're seeing, and then of course ongoing improvements of those capabilities truly come in. Healthcare has had AI integrated into the delivery of healthcare for a very long time, whether it was clinical decision support systems and some other back office kind of functions. Now, about AI, I kind of look at it actually not in terms of job replacement or issues with kind of its performance. I actually look at it in terms of this is probably the only way we're going to be able to break even in the type of care that is required based on the population. And so one fact that I had read somewhere, I think it was in the American Medical Association, something like 130,000 fewer radiologists are projected over the next 10 years. And then on top of that, 8,000, somewhere around 7,000 to 8,000 fewer pathologists. And so I would look at this in terms of how do we ensure that we're using technology to offset the gap?
Right.
And then you have on top of that significant physician or medical professional burnout that is happening.
Right.
So you have to integrate this into things that are, in my opinion, are existential.
Right.
In many ways, and existential being that if you don't have a medical professional, it doesn't matter
Right.
what technologies you have. You have to still integrate these things into what they do from a process perspective. And so I think that we have to, just like with everything else in life and business, you have to prioritize.
Yeah.
We have to prioritize based on gaps in labor shortage.
Right. Yeah.
Issues that we're going to end up having that are going to have downstream effects towards patient outcomes. People are already complaining about not being able to get a appointment for a month.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you have to integrate these things. You have to also use these technologies to remove the parts of the job that are causing a whole lot of burnout.
Right.
And I think AI, what it could do is it can allow a medical professional to be a medical professional.
Right.
Which is why they went there, to do patient care.
Yeah. That's a great answer, because I think a lot of people do worry about the job aspect of it. But what you're saying, and I think it's right, is it really supplements the work that's ongoing and makes it easier for docs and physician assistants and nurses and others just to do their job better.
Yeah,
right? So
absolutely.
what advice would you give members of Congress? Because they're talking about this a lot. They're hearing from companies and constituents a lot. They're forming their task forces. When they think about legislating in this area or regulating in this area, what advice would you give them? What cautions would you give them?
This is an area that I spend obviously a whole lot of time and working with Congress for them to understand some of the considerations. Is that AI, unlike traditional static medical devices, you have to think of in terms of a life cycle. So it's not just about how did you build the product, or in this case, it's how did you train the model, tune the model, but it's about how you're deploying it. It's how you're monitoring it. And so you really have to take a full life cycle aspect in the product's life cycle. And so any legislation has to kind of think through around the post-market performance monitoring aspect of it than purely the pre-market authorization, which is what FDA has always done.
Right.
Right. So in the drug side of things, you have phase 4 clinical trials, but it's not really regulated. AI, unfortunately, has to be regulated around making sure the performance does not degrade once you actually deploy the model itself in the real world.
Right.
Because you might have tested and tuned and trained the data with a specific population set, and then you proliferate that model in so many different environments, in this case hospital systems. You have to ensure that the benchmark performance is maintained in all of those different population sets that are represented in those hospital systems. That's a big area of focus where you also have to ask the question, who's responsible for that monitoring? Is it the application developers? Is it the hospital systems? I mean, these are some of the questions that you have to be able to answer.
Yeah. We talked about reimbursement policy. It's really important. Regulatory policy. It's really important. Before we started, you and I were having a conversation about interoperability and data. Talk about that from where you sit now and how important it is to get that piece right.
Well, I mean, without data, you don't have AI.
Yeah.
You might have poorly functioning AI.
Yeah.
The United States is a very interesting place because we don't have a single payer system. So we've been never incentivized to actually fix the underlying, and data to me is like the piping.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Without that, you're unable to truly uncover the things that you can uncover with the information. You can't build an artificial intelligence application that satisfies not just the clinical efficacy, but also the bias issues without having access to data, good quality curated data. The problem is that it's kind of wild west out there, right? I mean, there is no standards. We've tried. There's been interoperability discussions. There's a lot of money being spent on it, but there's always going to be a conflict between EHR vendors and medical device, and then how do you actually uncover all that data? How do you harmonize it?
Right.
FHIR was an opportunity, and I think it's probably fixing a lot of things, but we still are, in my opinion, ways to go.
Right.
Like, you have to fix the underlying
Right.
issue. But the quality of AI models will just not necessarily improve unless you can essentially feed it more information.
Yeah.
I read somewhere, I don't know, I never validated this, but it was actually it was a Europe economy, can't remember which agency it was, but it said like something like 97% of the data in hospital systems go untouched.
Oh my.
97%. So, from my point of view, that's just a cost. That's a cost center to you,
Right.
right? You're not leveraging it, and so
Right.
when someone argues with me about providing access to the data, you have to look at it in terms of what is it going to be able to do. It's probably you'll build better medical products, whether it's
Right.
pharmaceutical or medical devices.
Right.
But you have to fix that. You have to understand that you're not necessarily taking advantage of that data.
Yeah.
And maybe we should be, somewhat to a degree, democratizing that.
Yeah. Is that on the private industry to do that together versus having the government come in and do it for us?
I think there's always a combination, but the reality is that the private industry has to pay for it.
Yeah.
And so if they're not willing to pay for it, it's not going to necessarily get fixed.
Yeah. Yeah.
You could try to regulate it, but I don't think that's going to happen
Yeah.
because it's not a single payer system.
Yeah. Right. Well, it's been a great discussion. I want to close out, Troy, with my traditional lightning round questions that I have that hopefully you looked at before. So if you didn't, you're going to have to answer them real quick. So what's your favorite, or maybe I should say most influential book that you've read?
Probably The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho.
Oh, yeah. And why?
It was about the journey.
Yeah.
And there was this one at the end of it where the main character, he's yelling at the alchemist, like, why did you make me go through all of these things for me to discover that it was where I started? And the alchemist responds, but the pyramids were quite beautiful, weren't they? And I just love that.
Yeah, that's great.
I've read that book probably 10 times.
That's
at
great.
least.
It's DC, right? So we have to ask
Yeah.
you this question. Who's your favorite president and why?
Well, I think maybe it was probably when I was growing up too. I was a big fan of Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
I think he was just so charismatic, and
Yeah.
I'm also one of those. Contrary to being from San Francisco, I'm a fairly fiscally conservative individual.
Right.
And it's the last time, and probably the only time we ever had a balanced budget.
Yep.
I think he was. He made the presidency accessible, but I've also been very much enjoying George W. Bush as an ex-president.
Yeah.
I think what he's doing right now and spending a lot of time in Africa villages, his painting, I appreciate him as an ex-president.
Yeah, he's a good guy. If you could have dinner with one person, alive today or from the past, who would you choose? Would it be Clinton?
No, it'd probably be Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones.
Okay. Is that just because you love his music or because you find something about him particularly fascinating?
I find him very fascinating.
Yeah.
I find him very fascinating, and I haven't thought about this at all. It would be two guitars in the desert somewhere with a
Right.
bottle of whiskey.
Yeah.
But I haven't thought this one through. But I think he would be fascinating to talk
Yeah.
to.
And
just seeing what he's seen.
Yeah, and the question is, where would that conversation end, right? So,
All right, I don't know.
that'd be fun. So, your most important success in life and your most important failure.
The most important success. What would be my most important success? I think understanding the process, like how to navigate through the process and how to influence through that without having to completely break it and be thoughtful about it. My biggest failure probably was not also appreciating the process and trying to accelerate it, and I realized that it's very difficult to do that.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes those are attached to one another.
Yeah. Well, our hope is that a couple of years from now, you'll look back and say your most important success was going to the FDA and leading the transformation in AI and digital, because I think there's a great opportunity there. So,
I agree. It's been a wonderful experience. It's been also just being able to work with the type of people on the type of projects and problems is just such a I've been very thankful to be able to have this opportunity.
And we are too. I mean, it's not often that you get somebody with your background and your experience, and also with the level of accessibility that we've seen with you and the transparent conversations that industry can have with you about how to work through the process. It makes a big difference. And at the end of the day, I always say the reason it makes a big difference is because there's a patient at the end of that, right? And everything we're working on is going to impact somebody's life. And I think digital improvements and AI and all that's going on in the medical technology space is just going to make healthcare better if we get it right? And so the work you're doing is really important. So,
and then it is about the patient.
Yeah.
I mean, it's about improving outcomes.
Yeah.
I was inspired because unfortunately I didn't have that outcome that I wanted. But I always talk about you can either go internal and be destructive or self-destructive, or you can try to be constructive. And sometimes it's very hard to be constructive. Not now, but I mean in that initial few years were very difficult. But I do it in honor of her, and I want to keep on whatever I can contribute to at this point.
That's great. Well, thank you for journeying on and
Thank you.
for your leadership at FDA. We appreciate it. And thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
It's good to have you.
It's great to be here.
All right.
Thank you.